Welcome to History and Sleep, a place where the soothing sounds of history carry you off into a peaceful slumber. Tonight, we'll softly step back into the 18th century, where we'll learn about the life of George Washington, the first president of the United States. Let the calm of his story ease you into relaxation as we trace his humble beginnings, his rise to leadership, and his pivotal role in shaping the country. Don't worry about the details, just allow the rhythm of his life to settle your mind, as the whispers of history gently guide you toward restful sleep. Today, let's take a peaceful journey through history, back to the 18th century, when America was still finding its identity. We're going to dive into the story of George Washington, a figure whose influence shaped the very foundation of the United States. As you close your eyes and settle into comfort, imagine yourself stepping back in time. Picture the soft, rolling hills of colonial Virginia, the winding Potomac River, and the stately tobacco plantations dotting the landscape. This was the world George Washington was born into, a world vastly different from the one we know today. His story is one of resilience, leadership, and a lifelong dedication to duty. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia. He was the first son of Augustine Washington and his second wife, Mary Ball Washington. George's father owned a plantation and was well respected in Virginia society, which provided the young George with certain privileges, but they lived modestly. George's childhood was marked by hard work and discipline, values instilled in him by his mother. His father passed away when George was only 11 years old, leaving his older half-brother, Lawrence, as an important role model in his life. Lawrence Washington had a significant influence on young George. Lawrence was well educated, having spent time in England and serving in the British Navy. He encouraged George to follow a path in the military and taught him a great deal about leadership and service. Lawrence's home, Mount Vernon, would eventually become George's, a place he would come to treasure deeply and later leave his own mark upon. Growing up, George attended a nearby school where he learned reading, writing, and mathematics. But unlike many young men of his standing, he did not travel to England for a formal education. Instead, he found himself drawn to practical skills, particularly the art of surveying, which would become his first profession. Surveying allowed him to understand the land he grew up on, and by the time he was 17, he had secured a position as the official surveyor for Culpeper County, Virginia. This role allowed him to travel far and wide, taking him deep into the wilderness. The vast and untamed land left a strong impression on George, fostering in him a deep appreciation for the beauty, complexity, and potential of America. He spent long hours on foot, often alone, measuring boundaries, mapping lands, and witnessing firsthand the challenges and possibilities of life in the colonies. In 1752, George's life took a significant turn when his brother Lawrence died of tuberculosis. In his will, Lawrence left George the estate of Mount Vernon, though it would be years before it formally became his. Around this time, tensions between Britain and France were growing. Both powers desired control over North America, and conflict seemed inevitable. Washington, who was eager to prove himself, joined the Virginia militia, marking the start of his military career. Just a year later, in 1753, he was given his first significant mission. At the age of only 21, he was tasked with delivering a message to the French, warning them to leave the Ohio Valley. The journey through dense forests and icy rivers was perilous, but George completed it, gaining valuable experience and the respect of his superiors. In 1754, Washington saw his first real battle at Fort Necessity, where he led a small, inexperienced group of militia in a skirmish against the French. Although the battle ended in surrender, it was a formative experience, teaching him important lessons about warfare, leadership, and resilience. His actions brought him recognition, and he continued to serve with distinction throughout the French and Indian War. By the war's end in 1763, he had earned the rank of colonel, learning tactics and strategies that would serve him well in the years to come. With the war over, George retired to Mount Vernon, turning his attention to building a life on the land he had come to love. In 1759, he married Martha Custis, a wealthy widow with 2 young children. Their union brought George not only financial stability, but also companionship and a sense of purpose. He became a devoted stepfather to Martha's children, and together, they cultivated a life that centered around family, agriculture, and a commitment to Virginia society. Washington poured his energy into managing the plantation, experimenting with crop rotation, and seeking ways to improve the land. He took pride in his work and developed a strong attachment to Mount Vernon, a place that would always call him back, no matter where life took him. As the years passed, Washington grew increasingly concerned about the relationship between Britain and its American colonies. The British Parliament passed a series of laws imposing taxes and restrictions on the colonies, including the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, measures that directly affected the lives of everyday colonists. Washington, like many others, grew increasingly frustrated. He believed these laws violated the rights of the colonies and undermined their autonomy. He watched as resentment grew among his fellow Virginians, and he, too, began to feel that change was necessary. In 1774, Washington was elected as a delegate to the First Continental Congress, a gathering of colonial leaders who sought to address grievances with Britain. Washington joined other prominent figures in calling for change, initially hoping for reconciliation with the British Crown. But as tensions continued to rise, the idea of independence became increasingly appealing. The situation escalated in April 1775 with the battles of Lexington and Concord, the first real conflicts between British soldiers and American colonists. News of these battles spread quickly, igniting a desire for independence. It was clear that the colonies needed a leader, someone who could unify the people and lead them in a fight for freedom. George Washington, with his military background, moral character, and sense of duty, was chosen to command the newly formed Continental Army. Leading the Continental Army was a monumental task, one that would require immense strength, patience, and perseverance. The army Washington inherited was poorly trained, underfunded, and constantly facing shortages of food, clothing, and supplies. Many soldiers lacked basic training, and morale was often low. But Washington's leadership was crucial in keeping the troops united and determined. He became a source of hope and inspiration for his soldiers, who looked up to him as a symbol of American freedom and resilience. His presence alone inspired a sense of loyalty and purpose, and he tirelessly worked to instill discipline, training his men and teaching them to work together as a cohesive unit. In the dead of night on December 25, 1776, George Washington led one of the most daring maneuvers of the American Revolution, a crossing of the icy Delaware River that would transform both his reputation and the morale of the entire Continental Army. Picture the scene. A bitter winter storm whipped through the air, with freezing winds cutting through the soldiers' thin, worn-out coats. It was a moment of high stakes and high drama. The Continental Army had suffered repeated setbacks, and morale was at a breaking point. Many soldiers lacked shoes, their feet wrapped in rags as they breathed the bitter cold. Washington, however, understood that a decisive action was needed to turn the tide, to inspire his weary troops and prove that victory was still within reach. Washington had selected Christmas night deliberately, banking on the element of surprise. His plan was to strike Trenton, where a Hessian regimental group of German mercenaries fighting for the British was stationed. The Hessians, led by Colonel Johann Rall, were known for their fierce discipline and combat prowess, making them a formidable opponent. But caught up in holiday celebrations and confident that no army could attack in such brutal weather, the Hessians felt secure and unthreatened. Washington saw this as an opportunity to catch them off guard, to seize a victory that would demonstrate the strength and determination of the Continental Army. Late that night, with only dim lanterns lighting their way, Washington's forces assembled on the riverbanks. In silence, the soldiers loaded into Durham boats, flat-bottomed boats typically used to transport iron ore, and began the treacherous crossing. The waters were swollen with ice floes, making the journey perilous, rowing against strong currents and contending with dense chunks of ice. The men fought exhaustion and freezing temperatures. Washington himself stood at the helm, calm and resolute, a steady presence guiding his men through the storm. Each soldier rowed in silence, fully aware that failure was not an option. By dawn, the troops had finally reached the opposite shore, though they were hours behind schedule. Undeterred, Washington pressed forward, organizing his soldiers for the long march to Trenton. The conditions were harsh, with snow and sleet lashing at them, yet they trudged on in grim determination. Despite the delay, the element of surprise remained intact. The Hessians, unsuspecting and unprepared, had no idea of the American forces approaching under the cover of early morning light. As they reached Trenton, Washington split his forces into two groups, advancing on the town from multiple angles. The Hessians, taken by surprise, scrambled to defend themselves. Musket fire erupted in the streets as Washington's men poured in, forcing the Hessians to retreat. Washington rode up and down the lines, shouting encouragement, his presence galvanizing his men. Despite the grueling conditions they had endured, they fought with an intensity and unity that stunned the enemy. Colonel Ward, though brave, was fatally wounded as he tried to rally his troops, leaving the Hessians in disarray. Within hours, over 900 Hessians surrendered, and the Americans seized essential supplies and ammunition. The victory at Trenton was more than just a tactical win. It was a much-needed psychological boost for Washington's army, proving that they could stand up to the British and their formidable allies. The victory electrified the American cause and revitalized the soldiers' spirits, reigniting the faith that victory was possible. Men who had been ready to abandon the fight felt inspired once more, while the public, previously disheartened, took heart. New recruits began to join the army, drawn by stories of Washington's bold leadership and the triumphant success at Trenton. But Washington knew that the path to independence would still be long and arduous. Trenton was a pivotal win, but it was not the end. The British Empire possessed vast resources, both financially and militarily, and the Continental Army would not win through brute force alone. Washington therefore adopted a strategy rooted in patience and endurance, carefully choosing when and where to engage. He understood that preserving the army was as critical as any single battle. As long as his army remained intact, the revolution would live on. Washington's strategy in the years that followed was marked by calculated withdrawals, bold raids, and guerrilla tactics aimed at frustrating the British forces. He emphasized the importance of enduring, of surviving each battle and retreating if necessary, so that his army could fight another day. Washington realized that the war would not be won in a series of grand engagements, but in a sustained campaign of attrition that would wear down the British resolve. By outlasting his opponents, by forcing them to exhaust their resources and patience, Washington could tip the scales of the conflict. This approach would come at a tremendous cost. Washington and his men would face grueling winters, supply shortages, and immense hardship. But it was this careful balance between caution and boldness, forged at Trenton, that kept the Continental Army fighting against all odds. Washington's victory at Trenton was not only a military triumph, but a testament to his strategic vision, a vision that prioritized the long game, that understood the importance of morale, resilience, and endurance. In many ways, that Christmas night crossing the Delaware became a symbol of the resolve that would ultimately secure America's independence. The winter of 1777 to 78 at Valley Forge was a true crucible for George Washington and the Continental Army, a period of immense suffering, but also one of the most defining moments of the American Revolution. Valley Forge wasn't a battleground of musket fire and cannon blasts. Instead, it was a silent test of endurance, marked by bitter cold, relentless hunger, and the constant specter of disease. Washington and his men arrived in December 1777, preparing to make camp as the weather worsened. The British, meanwhile, had taken control of Philadelphia, enjoying a winter of relative comfort, while the Americans struggled to survive in makeshift huts in the Pennsylvania wilderness. For the nearly 12,000 men who encamped at Valley Forge, daily life became a battle against the elements. Supplies were scarce, food rations dwindled, and many soldiers were reduced to eating a thin, tasteless fire cake made of flour and water, as meat, vegetables, and other sustenance ran out. Some soldiers resorted to boiling their shoes to extract the last bit of leather for nutrients. Many lacked proper clothing, with tattered uniforms failing to keep out the biting winter winds. Shoes were in such short supply that soldiers wrapped their feet in rags, which did little to protect them from the snow and ice. Bloody footprints often marked the paths of soldiers who marched barefoot through the harsh winter conditions. Adding to their woes was the rampant spread of disease. Typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia swept through the camp, claiming the lives of over 2,000 soldiers. Medical supplies were scarce, and field hospitals were often overwhelmed, offering little relief to the men who fell ill. The living conditions were dire, and every day brought new stories of soldiers succumbing to illness, fatigue, and despair. Under such grueling conditions, desertions increased as morale hit a low point, and some questioned whether the revolution was worth the price they were paying. But in the midst of this suffering, George Washington's presence was a powerful force. He did not simply issue orders from a place of comfort. Instead, he chose to live among his men, sharing in their struggles and enduring the same hardships. Washington's own quarters were modest, and he often walked through the camp, stopping to speak with soldiers, inquiring about their well-being and offering words of encouragement. He became a visible and steadying presence, a leader who shared their burdens and frustrations. This act of solidarity was not lost on his men. Washington's willingness to suffer alongside them earned him their profound respect and loyalty. The soldiers came to see him not as a distant figure of authority, but as one of their own, a man who was prepared to face the same dangers and discomforts for the sake of the cause. It was during this harsh winter that the Continental Army underwent a transformation. Washington recognized the need for greater discipline and cohesion if they were to continue fighting effectively. Enter Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian military officer who had arrived to aid the American cause. Von Steuben, with Washington's full support, began drilling the soldiers, transforming them from a loosely organized militia into a disciplined fighting force. Day by day, he taught them essential military tactics, formations, and the fundamentals of soldiering, all under the harsh winter conditions. His training instilled in the troops a newfound sense of confidence, organization, and professionalism. By spring, the soldiers who emerged from Valley Forge were markedly different from those who had entered it, a seasoned, unified force capable of meeting the British in open combat. Valley Forge had become a place of transformation, not only for the Continental Army, but also for the soldiers' perception of Washington. The winter of suffering solidified his role not just as a commander, but as a symbol of perseverance and hope. Despite the suffering, there was a profound sense of purpose that bound the men together. Washington had kept his army intact, and by sharing in their trials, he had instilled in them a sense of resilience that would carry them through the long, grueling war ahead. When the winter finally broke and spring arrived, the Continental Army left Valley Forge stronger and more determined than ever. Washington and his men had endured, and in doing so, they had forged a bond that would fuel their fight for independence. Valley Forge was not just a military camp. It was a testament to the strength of the human spirit, the resilience of a fledgling nation, and the unwavering dedication of George Washington and his soldiers to the ideals of liberty and freedom. With the help of French allies, who provided much-needed support, the war finally reached a turning point. In 1781, British General Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, marking the end of major combat. After years of hardship, sacrifice, and perseverance, the American colonies had achieved what many thought impossible: independence from Britain. The victory was a testament to Washington's leadership, resilience, and unshakable commitment to the cause of freedom. After the war, Washington hoped to retire to Mount Vernon and live out his days in peace, but the young nation was still fragile, facing many challenges as it sought to build a stable government. In 1787, delegates from each state gathered in Philadelphia to draft a new constitution that would address the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. Washington was elected to preside over the Constitutional Convention, where his leadership helped unite the delegates and foster an atmosphere of cooperation and compromise. His calm, steady influence guided the discussions, and when the Constitution was completed, it laid the foundation for a new government that balanced power between the states and the national government. After the Constitution was ratified, the country needed a leader, and once again, the people turned to Washington. Although he initially resisted, he eventually agreed, understanding the importance of setting a strong example for the future. In 1789, George Washington became the first president of the United States, a role he approached with humility and a deep sense of responsibility. As president, Washington faced the immense task of building a government from the ground up. He carefully chose advisors, including Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and Henry Knox, who would help him navigate the complex issues facing the new nation. Washington believed in a strong yet limited government, one that respected the rights of individual states while maintaining national unity. He established many traditions, including the two-term limit, which would be followed until Franklin D. Roosevelt's presidency over 150 years later. One of his most famous acts was his farewell address, in which he warned against political parties, fearing that they would divide the nation, and advised America to avoid foreign alliances that could entangle it in unnecessary conflicts. After stepping down from the presidency in 1797, George Washington looked forward to a well-deserved retirement at Mount Vernon. He had served his country tirelessly, first on the battlefield, and then in the highest office, setting a precedent for a peaceful transition of power. His vision was to finally enjoy the peaceful life of a farmer, to reconnect with the rhythms of the land he loved, and to spend time with his family. Returning to Mount Vernon meant more than just resting. It meant re-immersing himself in the place that had been his sanctuary through years of upheaval. He eagerly took to the management of his estate, tending to his crops, experimenting with new farming techniques, and making improvements on the grounds. Washington had always believed that the strength of America lay in its land and agriculture, and he poured his energies into the soil, determined to lead by example in this, as in everything. But even in retirement, Washington's sense of duty to the nation was unwavering. He remained deeply concerned about America's future, as the young country was still finding its footing. Domestic and foreign challenges loomed, and the threat of conflict with France made tensions high. In 1798, when President John Adams asked Washington to lead the country's army once more in preparation for possible war, Washington agreed, accepting the role of Commander-in-Chief of the United States Army. Though he knew it was unlikely he would see active combat, his willingness to step forward again showed his commitment to the nation's welfare. Even in his 70s, Washington was prepared to lead if necessary, believing that his duty to the country had no expiration date. In December 1799, however, Washington's life took a sudden and tragic turn. After riding out on his estate in cold and wet weather, he developed a sore throat and began to experience symptoms of a severe respiratory infection. As the illness rapidly worsened, his doctors were called to his bedside, but the medical practices of the time were limited. They attempted to treat him using bloodletting, a common but dangerous treatment that ultimately weakened him further. Despite their best efforts, Washington's condition declined, and on the evening of December 14, 1799, he passed away at Mount Vernon with Martha by his side. His final hours were marked by composure and dignity, his last words reportedly being, "I am just going. Have me decently buried, and do not let my body be put into the vault in less than 2 days after I am dead." The news of Washington's passing struck the nation with profound sorrow. Across the country, people mourned as though they had lost a member of their own family. Washington was more than a former president. He was the nation's first unifying figure, a man who had helped define American identity and inspire a sense of shared purpose. Cities held memorial services, and eulogies poured in from leaders and ordinary citizens alike. In Philadelphia, the nation's capital at the time, John Adams declared, "Our Washington is no more, the hero, the patriot, and the sage of America, the man on whom, in times of danger, every eye was turned, and all hopes were placed lives now only in his own great actions, and in the hearts of an affectionate people." Even in Europe, Washington's death was mourned. Napoleon ordered a 10-day period of mourning in France, honoring a leader whom he saw as the kindred spirit in the cause of liberty. Washington's passing was not only the loss of a leader, but the closing of a chapter. He had been with America from the beginning, guiding it through the Revolutionary War, the struggle for independence, and the formation of its government. In his death, the country felt the weight of standing on its own. Washington left behind a legacy that would endure for generations. He had set the standard for leadership and service, embodying principles that would guide future presidents and inspire countless Americans. The image of Washington as the father of his country remains central to America's collective memory, a reminder of the humility, integrity, and steadfast devotion to freedom that shaped the nation's early years. His spirit endures in every American institution, every tradition, and every value that he helped to define. For a nation finding its place in the world, George Washington's life and legacy were, and remain, a beacon of strength, unity, and purpose. As you drift off to sleep, let your mind wander to that early America, a land of endless potential and new beginnings. Picture Washington, standing tall, looking out over his beloved Mount Vernon, knowing that he had played his part in shaping a nation that would endure long after his time. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with peace, resilience, and the quiet strength that defined George Washington's remarkable life.